So I'm going to give my individual presentation over our research project. So background information on our research project. We wanted to do something correlating to mindfulness and regulation of emotions and kind of figuring out how those go hand in hand. So when we did do our background research, most, if not all, of the articles that we found were based off of either recovery from post-war PTSD, trauma exposure and mindfulness, or mindfulness training and emotional regulation. But most of these contributed into not necessarily verbal conflict or focused around much heavier topics than what we kind of wanted to center in on, because trauma exposure and PTSD and depression, bipolar disorder, stress, relationship conflict, and work conflict kind of didn't really hit where we were trying to focus in because of the amount of information that was present for these. We wanted to dive into something that wasn't so present already in current research. But from this previous research, we figured out, that mindfulness can assist in recovery from different challenges, the ones that I mentioned above, and it also enhances emotional regulation skills. And this is a key factor in recovery processes. So, in doing that, we kind of came up with the conclusion of forming our hypothesis around mindfulness and the recovery of an interpersonal verbal conflict, making our research question, can mindfulness, being presence and non-judgment of one's emotional experience, and aid in the recovery of an interpersonal verbal conflict? Our hypothesis was that higher mindfulness ability can result and will result in a more efficient recovery from an interpersonal verbal conflict. So for our methodology, we ended up having 57 participants. We had 90 originally, but a lot of them were invalid due to different circumstances. We collected our participants based off of social media platforms and through the people we know. Sorry about that. Before participation, we had certain inclusion criteria, just basic understanding of English, minimum age of 18, but we didn't have any exclusionary criteria because we were trying to gain the largest sample size population that we could due to restrictions of COVID related. And if these participants did follow through and consent to participate, they completed an 89 question survey through Qualtrics. This consisted of 3 psychological scales, the DERS, the FFMQ, and a scale that we created ourselves, the ICRS. Yeah, ICRS. Sorry. And we also had some basic demographic questions regarding age and biological sex and all of that. So, as I mentioned, the scales that we used were the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, difficulties in emotional regulation scale, and interpersonal conflict recovery scale. So the 5-facet measures mindfulness and its impact on different life events and aspects of life. And there's 5 dimensions to this, which include observing, describing, acting with awareness, non-judging of inner experience, and non-reactivity. The DERS scale is 36 items, and it's very similar to the 5-facet, but this focuses more in on emotional regulation rather than mindfulness. So this measures 6 facets of emotional regulation, which are listed below, and it just centers more so around questions based on actual emotions that you're feeling and how you process emotions regarding different responses to different events. The ICRS is a scale that we created ourselves because we couldn't find something that fit into the category of recovery scales that we wanted. None of them really centered around emotion and conflict. So we created one of our own, and this measures the process of recovery from interpersonal verbal conflict, which is what we are centering our whole study over. And the dimensions it includes are rumination, avoidance, difficulty in overcoming negative emotions, and frequency of undesired emotions when revisiting conflict. So for our results, we had a Cronbach alpha and independent sample t-test, and there were no shown significant differences for the demographic groups. But for the DERS, our alpha was 0.96, FFMQ was 0.93, and the ICRS was 0.88. So for our results, we did bivariate correlation between the ICRS and FFMQ and DERS. So these results were shown in the presentation. The standard deviation for the FFMQ was 22.38, and the DERS was 26.83. And with the bivariate correlation to the FFMQ, the DERS correlated with that, having a mean of 77.96. So these findings suggest that recovery from interpersonal verbal conflict is associated with mindfulness aspects of emotional regulation. So recovery from interpersonal verbal conflict improves with increased mindfulness and emotional regulation skills. And as shown, participants with low scores on the ICRS signaled more effective recovery and demonstrated high scores on the FFMQ and the DERS, and lower scores on the DERS, creating the bivariate correlation. And these scores on the DERS and FFMQ elicit high mindfulness and emotional regulation. So these are just the subcategories of the FFMQ correlating with the DERS subcategories. These indicate that the higher scores on the FFMQ, the lower the scores should be on the DERS. Make sure I have this in the right. Okay, sorry, I had to make sure I have separate notes. So continuing our main analyses, so DERS correlated with the FFMQ subcategories of observing, describing, awareness, non-judgment, and non-reactance. So the results indicated those who scored low on the DERS demonstrated high emotional regulation and tended to score high on the FFMQ. And this also signals high mindfulness. And with these findings, they suggest that high mindfulness may be associated with high emotional regulation within individuals themselves. So as you can see, all of the means are around the same. And the non-judgment and non-reactance means are exactly the same. And we have describing that is the highest mean with a standard deviation of 6.43. And our highest standard deviation was 8.08 in the non-judgment category. So the only significant t-test that we found was that males scored higher on the FFMQ subcategory of non-reactance than females did. There weren't any other subcategories that were significant, but this did exceed the Cohen's convention for a large effect of D point, with our effect size being D equaling 0.897 when it shows an effect at 0.8. So This significant finding suggests that on average, men may display lower levels of emotional reactance in comparison to females. But overall, the results supported all of our hypotheses through correlations implying strong relationships between mindfulness and emotional regulation and their positive effect on recovery from verbal conflict. So we did have a few limitations when doing our study. Our diversity was pretty limited, and our overall pool of participants were also very limited. We had 57 participants, and out of the 57, 55 identified as Caucasian, leaving only 2 who did not identify as Caucasian. There was less of a difference between biological sex, but there was still a difference with 35 females and 22 males. But we think this is most likely caused by the lack of ability to have a greater research pool, which I'll go into next. But our overall research pool of participants was limited just due to lack of responses and things outside of our means of delivery. But we sent out our surveys only onto 2 forums, Reddit and Facebooks, in each of our circles of friends and family. So we think that if we would have sent those out more so earlier or to more forums, we would have got more responses. But then again, we cannot control who does actually end up taking their survey. We can only control how we send it out and where we send it out. So we didn't necessarily test the construct intended, but we tested surrounding byproducts of other concentration areas of our study. So it's possible that the questions that we asked could have inadvertently given us answers to a different question rather than what we were asking, which means like our data could have told us more so about emotional regulation in itself rather than recovery rate from interpersonal verbal conflicts. So that's kind of another limitation. The absence of experimental control. The research was limited in this regard because extraneous variables that may affect recovery process were not able to be accounted for in the data collection, thus possibly skewing our results. Although this is true, if we were to use experimental control rather than having everyone imagine their own scenario like we did, having a set concrete example of a specific interpersonal verbal conflict could help us provide a more uniform example to help measure our information more accurately by having everyone have the same idea of that specific event rather than everyone having their own, creating different levels of responses and different severity levels of events too. Another thing that we had was the uncertainty of our ICRS measure. The ICRS scale exhibiting high reliability after one test run doesn't mean that it has been accurately assessed in terms of reliability and validity, but this is because this is a new scale, we created it, it doesn't have prior research done with it, but due to this concern, the ICRS may not accurately measure verbal conflict recovery and requires future assessment to ensure its effectiveness. And this could, like I said, hinder results due to the uncertainty of the instrument and if it does truly measure what it's intended to do. So okay. So with our implications, this fills prior research gaps with emphasis on verbal conflict. So prior research focused more on recovery and PTSD and more so on mental illnesses rather than just interpersonal conflict. So we centered ours on verbal conflict, And it also, previous research also includes findings on recovery and conflict within romantic relationships as well as work conflict. So our study differed from these, like I said, because it put an emphasis on the recovery process of these verbal conflicts. And our hypothesis supported the notion in previous research that practicing mindfulness does improve emotional regulation. And our prediction based off of prior research that mindfulness aids in a more effective recovery was also supported, which helps aid in finding more information about this topic in future studies regarding recovery. The last implication is that this develops further insight about effects of varying magnitudes of conflict. So we included commonalities and differences regarding recovery from the conflict and how people handle these verbal altercations. And with our hypothesis being supported, this supplies us with a better understanding of how verbal conflict may actually impact one's well-being. And lastly, we have future research. So for the future, we would suggest finding new methods for gathering data, such as going to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Reddit, community emails, different classes, so on. Just getting an increased amount of participants so that we can expand our population and make it more diverse as well. Having an increase in the number of participants as well as the diversity will lead future researchers and studies to see if there are trends in relations among different races and ethnicities, because we couldn't do that because we did not have a diverse enough population to actually see if there are prevalent differences in those. Like I mentioned, we want to increase the number of participants as well to do that and have the diverse sample of participants, just so we can have more data and get more information to support our hypothesis further and be able to investigate more correlations within our study rather than what we just had based off of our number of participants. For future research, having an accurate and reliable recovery measure would be important, because for our study, we did develop our own scale for recovery, like I mentioned. And because of that, it is harder to measure something we created ourselves because it doesn't necessarily accurately represent the recovery measure that we needed for our study. It doesn't contain ensured reliability or validity due to no prior research on the measure. And we couldn't reverse any code. We couldn't reverse code any of our questions in our scale, so that also leads to more reliability and validity issues relating to that recovery measure scale. And lastly, we have implementation of experimental control. I've touched on this before, but implementing future studies with experimental control would ensure that no outside factors were skewing the data. And the limitation is that our study is based on purely correlational evidence, making it hard to be applied into real-world situations because no real-life examples were utilized in our data collection, just a set specific imagine this scenario type of thing. And then those are our references. Thank you.